So this is part of a four-part series on individuals, human beings, our behavior, and how that can affect foreign policy decision-making, particularly when we're focusing on leaders. And so I want to just begin with just sort of a big picture reflection. And in the class I teach, one of the things we'll watch is The Fog of War, which sort of really is a critique of this idea of procedural rationality as a guarantee of good outcomes. And so if you're not familiar with the movie, it's a really fantastic documentary about the life of Robert McNamara and his role as Secretary of Defense and during a number of major international crises and decisions for the United States. And Robert McNamara, in a lot of ways, represents the ideal of procedural rationality, right? That he was able to identify goals, that he was very systematic in considering options and weighing costs and benefits. And then in theory, out of that process, you should get, the selection of the best course of action. And yet, in spite of McNamara's professed sort of rigor as a thinker and as a rational analyst, I think the movie really hammers home this idea that there are other elements going on in how human beings process information, how human beings evaluate crisis situations, and that there's maybe more to the story than just simply human rationality. Um, One thing that I would like to sort of flag that I think is really important in terms of thinking about this idea of rationality and one of its limitations is that in any given situation, there's just always too many possible options to really consider. That leaders, even if they're being systematic, even if their personality is to be, rigorous and rational and cool and calm and information driven, they're going to encounter information overload. That there's just too much information available to consider, and compounding that problem even further, there's often not enough of the right information. So you have this problem of like just being flooded with possible information and facts and details, but most of it is not what you really need to know. That the right information, the critical pieces of information, are not at your fingertips when you need them, or in a timely enough way to be helpful. And so we really face this sort of challenge as human beings of navigating these twin dimensions of there's just too much information available, and yet it's not oftentimes what we really need to be effective as decision makers. We as human beings have psychological quirks that maybe compound some of these problems, that the ways that we fill in the gaps or we process that information can be less than helpful. Folks who study foreign policy decision making and leaders have noted a couple of these different patterns. So one of them is attribution theory, where we sort of tell the story about ourselves. Oftentimes, there's this idea that we are good, and that it's automatically recognized by everybody else that we have good intentions, and that we are not wishing ill on somebody else. And then the flip side of that is that the others are bad, and that we can understand their behavior as bad, that they do bad things, that they only do bad things, and that it's obvious to everybody that they are up to no good. And so we sort of fall into these sort of narratives of categorizing other actors in a way that maybe helps us or prevents us from seeing the nuance of specific situations. Another sort of example of this is what's called mirror image thinking, which instead of sort of differentiating yourself and saying this is me and that's you, there's sort of the assumption that you and I are going to be maybe identical in our behavior and our reactions. And I think maybe for me, the most interesting example of this was during the Cold War, where the entire US nuclear posture was built around this idea of a triad. That there's these intercontinental ballistic missiles, that there are submarines that are armed with intercontinental ballistic missiles, and there are bombers that can reach the Soviet Union and blow stuff up. And part of the logic for intercontinental ballistic missiles was that having intercontinental ballistic missiles out in sort of North Dakota and elsewhere where there's very few people would function as what were called warhead sinks. And the idea is that these things are cemented into the ground, and if you're going to effectively, neutralize a intercontinental ballistic missile on the ground before it can be fired, it's going to take at least one, probably two, and almost certainly three warheads to have, absolute confidence that you've blown this thing up and it's not going to be able to fire. And so when the United States was making calculations about how to destroy the Soviet arsenals, and their intercontinental ballistic missiles, the assumption was it's going to take three warheads. And therefore, every intercontinental ballistic missile that you build in North Dakota is going to be able to draw three Soviet warheads away from population centers and out to, well, North Dakota. But that was mirror image thinking. The United States was making an assumption that the Soviet Union was making the same kind of calculations that the United States was making, when in fact the Soviet Union looked at that and said, one warhead's good enough. We're not going to get them all. It won't be perfect, but one warhead per missile is probably fine, right? So there's this misunderstanding of the adversary based on the assumption that they're thinking through problems the same way you are. There's wishful thinking, which folks tend to be familiar with, this idea that we don't consider the downside, that we just sort of hope that things will work out, that we don't really work with and wrestle with the evidence that points in a negative direction, because we really just desperately are sort of willing things to be okay. This might be related to motivated reasoning, but motivated reasoning encompasses some other things. That's this idea that we reject new information because it conflicts with our existing worldviews. And there's actually, I think, some brain science behind this, that as we develop a model of the world, our brains literally like construct synapses and connections and strengthen them that allow for information to sort of flow through our brains more quickly as we process familiar ideas. But when we encounter information that contradicts what we've sort of built up in our heads, our brain sort of gets stuck and the information doesn't really know where to go, and there's not well-established pathways. And so it's actually easier to route that contradictory information through our existing neural pathways, rewriting it, changing it, making it confirmation that we were right all along. Human beings do this. We have a really hard time accepting that our mental models are just wrong. And we will fight back against that. We will dismiss information. We will rewrite information. We will actively resist information that contradicts our worldviews. When we're trying to understand why human beings fall into these regular cognitive traps, particularly this idea of wishful thinking, I think there's a couple places where these flaws can occur. One of them is that we just misunderstand ourselves. People have a tendency to overestimate their abilities and their strengths and their ability to affect things. I think the United States in particular falls victim to this, that the United States tends to view itself as the only real actor in the international system, able to control and determine every possible outcome. And oftentimes the United States underestimates other actors, right? The perceptions of others are flawed in some way. The United States rarely anticipates the ability of other actors to resist or push back or pursue their own private interests. Or sometimes the United States and others just fundamentally misunderstand the nature of a situation. Not just underestimating others' behaviors, but underestimating just what's actually possible on the ground. And one of the sort of interesting dynamics of this is this idea of illusion of control, that we as human beings really struggle with this idea that there are just situations that we can't manage, that are just outside our control, where nothing that we do has an effect. And so we create in our head a narrative about how we're able to actually influence a situation where we have no influence. And we see this in the sort of the grand scheme of things, where every problem requires sort of US policymakers to sit down and hammer out a plan about what's the solution. There might not be one, but we also see it in sort of just like everyday little like quirks of human beings, right? And so, a gambler who is blowing on dice or regularly switching dice or has, lucky dice, the dice don't care. The dice are, not going to be affected by anything that we do. And yet we create these sort of rituals that help us to believe that we are in a situation where we're influencing things when that might actually not be the case.